The vaccines may weaken the immune system's ability to respond to actual threats. So why is this? Remember we talked about the different immune systems, right? If you're vaccinating, and the theory being that, that you are trying to stimulate the acquired immune system, so you're trying to get the body to create the lock and key response. So as soon as it recognizes this particular virus, the H1N1 comes in, it's going to recognize it and it's going to target it. But how does it go and create all this stuff? It has to use resources to do that. The body has to actually go and focus on this. And in fact, they find in many vaccinations that you are more susceptible to getting the disease within 2 weeks of getting the vaccine, depending on which vaccine, because your body is busy trying to do something. Now, we have to look, and we'll have some figures later, about what are the actual threats. What is your likelihood of coming in contact with H1N1 versus coming in contact with some of the millions of other things that are around? And what is the actual, when they were talking about the death rates of H1N1, it turns out that a lot of the problems that we're having may not have been actually H1N1. And we'll talk about, this was just a news story last night that came out from CBS. So that'll be something that we'll just discuss just briefly. There's some potentials that vaccinations can induce autoimmunity. There are studies showing that, that the body will produce autoantibodies also in response to vaccination. Not everyone, and the autoantibodies can go away, and it may not be something you don't necessarily, every time you get a vaccine, you're going to get lupus, but it's something to consider, because what are you doing? If you take a vaccine and you inject that substance in you just take H1N1 and inject it in an inactivated virus of H1N1, and inject it into you, your body will not respond to that. It'll be like, okay, whatever, it's not doing anything. I don't have to do anything for this. They can't get you to build antibodies to it. So how do they get you to build the antibodies to something that isn't really a threat to the body? Because these dead viruses are not threats to the body, right? Well, they have to put other things in the vaccine to make your body think, ooh, this is really bad. We need to do something about this. So they put other things like aluminum, like various other types of what they call adjuvants that stimulate the immune system and say, whoa.
Yeah, squalene is in there for that.
Squalene is in there as well.
Supercharge the immune system to create a response.
Yeah, and that there's also all kinds of I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it's just very weird. What? I'm not really. It's just, when there are a lot of conflicting things as a consumer, it's very difficult to wade through it. When they won't disclose ingredients, but they're saying that it's safe and something's not in there, then why would you bother saying something's in there or not in there if you're not going to disclose the ingredients? So it's just something that bothers me about it. So again, may induce autoimmunity. This is coming from studies. There are studies showing that the body does create these things. So it's something to consider. If you have a family history of autoimmunity, or you yourself have autoimmunity of some sort, vaccines could potentially exacerbate that, and it's something to consider. You have to weigh what are the chances of you getting a serious problem from whatever the threat is versus what are your possibilities of getting a problem from the vaccines. And the problem is the studies being done on safety are not really well conducted at all, and they're not long term, and we don't really have very good data on that, unfortunately. Even though they say it's good, it's another lecture as to why it's not. It's some weird techniques they use in in coming up with these safety data, and their conclusions are not in line with conclusions any rational person would draw. And I'll give you a very quick example. In one of the vaccines, the human papilloma virus, the HPV Gardasil, right? One of the safety studies they did to show that the vaccine was safe is they compared adverse events from the actual vaccine to adverse events from the vaccine without the HPV in it. So that vaccine without the HPV, their control, the placebo, actually still had aluminum in it and still had these other things. So when they compared the two, there was no big difference, which does tell you that it's likely that the HPV itself isn't causing a problem, but that doesn't mean the whole vaccine isn't causing a problem. And their conclusion wasn't that the HPV, that the Gardasil vaccine is safer or is just as safe as injecting yourself with the other components of the vaccine. They tell you that it's just safe. So we have to know as consumers that the safety, we need to be requiring from these people, okay, safety compared to what, right? If it's compared to not getting one, then, because the numbers, I forget the exact numbers, something like the placebo had a 70% adverse event and then the actual one had 70 something also. So 70% is pretty high in my mind to call something just completely safe. So at any rate, flu viruses mutate very rapidly. In order to be effective, the vaccine has to contain the same strain as the flu vaccines often do not work. Okay, the idea behind this is that in order for the flu vaccine to work, you have to have the same strain that you're vaccinated with. Okay, and they do seem to work. Okay, and I'm not saying they don't, but the problem is that they're looking in South America to see what's going to come up the next year. Sometimes they're right. When they're right, it seems that that particular virus doesn't show up as much. When they're wrong, then it doesn't. The vaccines don't really help much at all. Okay, disadvantages of conventional approach. Antibiotics. The antibiotics will also kill good bacteria, especially in your gut, and this can cause all kinds of chronic problems. A number of people get chronic digestive problems after taking antibiotics because the other organisms can then grow and get a foothold when you're killing off the good bacteria. And just taking good bacteria doesn't necessarily do the trick because the other ones are already resident there, and you just keep taking stuff and they just keep getting knocked out. So that's something you have to weigh when you're taking antibiotics, and that's why antibiotics is simply as a prevention is not something that we recommend, but it's a very good idea if you can identify there is a bacterial problem, there is a strain. So people going in with H1N1 or something and they say, oh, I feel really bad, and the doctor prescribes an antibiotic, it's like, well, because that's a lot of times the first line. Now they're doing Tamiflu, which is a little better if it is H1N1. Indiscriminate use creates resistant strains also. This is a huge problem now in hospitals. You have strains of bacteria that are resistant to their antibiotics. And this is just going to get worse and worse as we indiscriminately use antibiotics. Conventional approach suppresses symptoms, as we talked about. Most uncomfortable symptoms are part of natural defenses that have evolved over millions of years to effectively deal with a wide variety of pathogens. In Chinese medicine, the suppression of symptoms leads to chronic disease. Okay, so in Chinese medicine, if you don't express that cold, if you don't burn that up, what happens is that pathogen stays in your body. It just changes. Because at some point, you have to learn to live together. Either that virus is going to kill you, which does, or whatever it is, which does them no good and you no good, because how's it going to move on if it's dead and you're dead? So a lot of times, you end up having some synergistic relationship with these organisms. And then in Chinese medical theory, some of these organisms will end up being the things that create chronic disease. Sometimes it's because the organism is bad, and sometimes it's because your body ends up attacking it. So that organism gets stuffed over in your joints, and the body starts attacking your joints to attack the organism, and you end up with rheumatoid arthritis or some kind of inflammatory disease in your joints. So this is part of Chinese medical theory of why it's so important to treat colds properly when you get them. And it's so important to prevent chronic disease. Okay. So, subtypes of influenza. Did something happen weird?
Yeah, it was just the segue into it.
Oh, okay, so now we'll get to H1N1 while you all get here. So, subtype of influenza virus A and the most common cause of flu in humans. H1N1 strains caused roughly half of all human flu infections in 2006. Do you guys know that? Yeah. This is a particular version of the H1N1 that is somewhat new. All viruses are categorized according to proteins on the surface of the virus. This is just so you know what the H1N1 means, right? So the H is hemagglutinin, and the N